Let's look at independent and within group designs today and think about some of the advantages and disadvantages. When are we going to be using one or the other? So within group designs, there are some real advantages. We know that this group is equivalent to this group because they're the same people. They serve as their own control. And because they're the same, we need fewer people. Um, it also allows us to potentially demonstrate improvement, you know, um, from one condition to another. Um, in order to have, there are some questions in terms of internal validity within group designs because of order effects. So exposure to one condition may affect how participants respond to other conditions. We may have practice effects. We may have carryover effects. So for example, the mindfulness study where participants did the GRE both before and after either the mindfulness or the nutrition group, maybe there were practice effects that influenced how people did the second time. Now, because there were independent groups, we didn't have to worry about that as much. There may be carryover effects. So, for example, probably on average, the chocolate that you eat the second time isn't going to taste as good as the chocolate that you eat the first time. That's because when we're full, food doesn't taste as good. Now, there are two kinds of counterbalancing that can address these issues. There can be full counterbalancing, where we have groups for each of the particular designs that we're looking at, that have each order. So for example, here you see full counterbalancing when there are two groups. So in this first group, we have chocolate or eating chocolate alone, and then chocolate with a confederate, and vice versa. Now, it's easy when we only have two different conditions that we're comparing. If we have more than that, let's say we have three, then we need to have six different groups, and it becomes much more difficult to compare and much more expensive. So in terms of disadvantages, certainly that we have order effects and counterbalancing can help. Sometimes it just may not be practical or possible. So I can't compare two different reading strategies because this first strategy is going to impact the second one. And if someone actually experiences all levels of the independent variable, it may change the way that the participants act. And so, that's what we call demand characteristics, where the way that the experiment is set up demands certain kinds of outcomes. Now, there are advantages of independent group designs. There isn't any carryover effect or order effect, no practice effects. And as a result, they're sometimes more practical. But obviously, they're more expensive, right? 40 participants as opposed to 20 participants in this particular situation. So let's think about this. Why are these statements false? And you might turn off your camera between each statement. You always need a control group in an experiment. Right? We don't always. We may have two different levels of the treatment group. We may be comparing two different things. So for example, laptop and pen. And in some cases, we may even just have a single group. You always need a pretest in an experiment. And you've seen that we have looked at a number of experiments that did not have a pretest. For example, the baby persistence experiment, or the laptop and pen experiment. And you always need a random sample in an experiment. And here's where I want you to stop and think about random sample and random assignment. This is sort of a tricky one. We always need random assignment, but in an experiment, it's often difficult to obtain a random sample, of perhaps members of the entire community. Okay, so let's look at an experiment that was published in Science, a pretty big journal, one of the big ones. So in this study, Thomas et al., one of their videos showed a woman rolling a ball back and forth with a blue fuzzy puppet. This is for babies and babies are viewing it. Then another woman shares an orange with that same puppet by putting a slice of orange in her mouth, then putting it back in her own, then letting the puppet nibble on the slice, and then putting it back in her own mouth. Then they used looking time to measure what infants were thinking. So the video then shows the two women with the blue fuzzy puppet in between them. The puppet starts to cry and puts its head down as if it's suddenly unhappy. When the puppet cried, infants and toddlers looked first and looked longer at the woman who had shared bites of her orange. They're looking in that direction because they expect something to happen there, said Thomas. They expect that woman to be the one to respond to the puppet's distress. So this is actually a study about intimacy. And, we're much more likely to share food with someone we love than with a stranger. And we then expect different kinds of things from them. So think about what the independent variable is in this experiment and its levels. Is it manipulated as an independent group or within group design? What is the dependent variable? Which of the four simple experiments does this seem to be? Pre-test, post-test, post-test only, concurrent, repeated measures, and sketch a bar graph of the results. So I would turn off your video, work your way through this, and start again. Now, to make sure that it wasn't just, and this is another study in the Thomas et al. Experiment, to make sure that it wasn't just sharing of food that seemed to make babies infer the existence of a close social connection, the researchers created another similar video. This time, instead of sharing an orange slice, a woman simply put her finger in her own mouth and then put it in the purple puppet's mouth before putting it back in her own. So it's different, no food, it's only saliva that they're sharing. Then that woman also interacted with a green puppet, touching its forehead and then touching her own forehead. After the video, after that, the video showed the woman seemingly in distress with the purple and green puppets looking on. And you're not going to be surprised, but here the infants and toddlers tended to gaze at the purple puppet, the one that had, the finger in the mouth. They were sharing saliva, as if expecting this puppet to be more affected by the woman's distress, perhaps because they have a closer relationship. So notice how this builds on the previous experiment. Just as the Mahama Takata and Bob Kirk experiments, right? Much simpler, but this is a more complicated and actually more meaningful kind of experiment. So think about what the independent variables and dependent variables are in this study. Sketch a bar graph of the results that you might expect. It might be that infants just like purple puppets more than green puppets. How might the researchers rule out this alternative explanation? So turn off your video and just work your way through this. And I'm going to say goodbye. Take care.